Hi folks, this is a history lesson on women's rights. We're going to specifically talk about things leading up to the women's suffrage movement, which does not mean suffering, it means the right to vote. So we're talking about things leading up to women getting the right to vote, and we're not going to talk about the whole world today. We're just going to talk about the United States and Western Europe. So like England, Germany, Italy, Spain, France, that kind of section of Europe. Not the whole thing, because Europe is a big place. Now, the thing we want to know from the very beginning here is that because we're only talking about the United States and Western Europe, this is a wee tiny part of the picture. There are countries that, when women in the United States and Western Europe still didn't have many rights, there were countries where women had plenty of rights. And there are still countries now where women don't have many rights. If you're feeling interested in those things, go off and do some research. And the other thing I want to warn you about is that today we're going to do kind of the traditional textbook history version of women's rights, which means we're going to talk about stuff that is true, but we're not going to talk about all the details. We're going to have another history lesson later in the week about all of the details. For instance, we know that many times when things change, they change first for people who have a lot of money or are white. So in our story today, we're going to talk mostly about when things changed for white women in the United States and Western Europe, because things happened first there, because things are not always fair in history and sometimes it's a little messed up. Our history lesson later this week, we're going to talk about the real deal and how ridiculously long it took for some groups of women to get the same rights that they were fighting for in this story today. So let's get started on that. We know that back in the day, let's say in the 1600s, when colonies and business like that were going on, or in the 1400s when Columbus got lost, or any of those times, we know that women had certain roles that they were generally expected to have. They were supposed to, I'm going to do the stereotypical thing and put stick figures in dresses as women. I know that's absurd. Anyone can wear anything they want, but for the sake of our doodles today, dress equals women. I know. So traditionally, stick figure women and real women were expected to do things like raise children, cook, clean, stuff around the house, and not really much else. Now, if you were a woman who lived on the farm, you definitely busted your rear doing a whole lot of challenging and hard work also. But if you were a wealthy lady, probably your husband or your father went out of the house and did work, and you stayed at home and did things in the house. Now, in the 1700s, the thing called the Industrial Revolution came around. And we've talked about that before. But as a reminder, the Industrial Revolution is when a whole bunch of factories opened up. We read a book about a young girl who worked in a factory making thread, and she was in charge of putting the bobbins on and off, and it was like scary and dangerous, and they had to work really long hours. But remember, in that book, it was just like a young woman. She was, I think, 14 or 15. That happened in the 1700s. And when the Industrial Revolution happened, women started leaving the house to go work in some of those factories. Industrial Revolution. So women started to go work in those factories and no longer were always expected to stay home and just do work in the house. So this was kind of the beginning of the end for some of these you have to stay home and wear a stick person dress sort of rules. But in general, women still didn't have many rights. They couldn't vote. They couldn't own their own property in a lot of places. And they couldn't get a divorce from their husband if he wasn't a nice person. None of those things were part of women's life yet. But around the Industrial Revolution, they started being able to get jobs out of their house if they wanted to. In general, this happened more for people who didn't have as much money first because they couldn't afford to stay home. They had to go get more money so that they could, pay for food and things like that. So more often than not, the people working in those factories were women who didn't have a lot of money and had to. But women were then more normally expected to be allowed to work out of the house. People started doing things like getting jobs as teachers and a couple other things that women were allowed to do. Time goes on, because it does. And around the 1830s, in the United States at least, women started trying to get the right to do a couple other things. They wanted the right to own property. And get a divorce if they wanted to. And go to university, to go to college. It took a while for some of these things to happen. Remember that in 1890, when Maria Montessori went to school to be a doctor, she was still one of the first female doctors in all of Europe. She still was really picked on by all of the guys at the school because she was the only woman. She still wasn't allowed to go look at the cadaver lab with them and had to go in the middle of the night all by herself just to be able to learn. And that was 60 years past this. So clearly everything didn't happen quick and marvelously, but things kept changing little by little. And part of how women made things change, and some men who were decent and wanted women to have rights too, is they would gather together in conventions and give speeches and talk about what they wanted to change. And they would write letters to tell the government what they wanted to change. And in some places, they did some pretty nuts stuff. So in the 1840s and the 1850s, that's when the women's suffrage movement started. Remember, suffrage means having the right to vote. It has nothing to do with suffering. So it means that when someone runs to want to be a senator or a president or a prime minister or something of the country that you're in, you get to actually have a vote and your opinion matters. So in the 1840s and 50s, that's when the voting rights thing really got big. In the United States, a lot of people gathered at conventions and gave speeches and wrote articles in the newspaper about how women should have a right to vote, how they should be able to have their opinion matter. In England, something really fun that happened, I mean, not really fun for them, but fun for me to think about in a historical sense, is that a whole bunch of women who were working on trying to get the right to vote chained themselves to the prime minister's house and things like that. So, like, they took chains and locked themselves up to the gate in front of the prime minister's house, the person who helps be in charge of that country. Some of them also did really dramatic things like go on hunger strikes, like saying, I'm not going to eat at all until I get the right to vote, because the right to vote feels so important to me that I'm willing to hurt my own body to get that right. So some people that really helped doing this work in our country, in the United States, are people whose names you might have heard of before. There's Susan B. Anthony. I think there maybe should be an H in there. There should be an H in there. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth, not spelled like our Elizabeth, Cady Stanton. Those were two white women who had a fair amount of money who were helping with this. There were a lot of people who didn't get written down in history books because they were not white or did not have a lot of money. There were also some men who helped, some that you might know about from other lessons, like Frederick Douglass. He did a lot of work in the United States working for women to have the right to vote too, because he didn't think it was fair that only men did. So let's move forward through time and see when stuff actually happened. So let's see if orange shows up. In 1893. Oh, it does. In 1893, New Zealand was the first entire country to make a rule that women could vote for the whole country. They said, you know what? Actually, women should probably be involved in this. That's more than 100 years ago. That is 50 or 40 years after women started trying to get voting rights, started really working to try and get voting rights, and they still didn't have it. took until 1920. 1920, folks, that's 100 years back from now, for women in the United States to get voting rights. Now, remember, this doesn't mean all women. This means white women, because history is not always fair. We'll talk more about everything else and all of that messed up stuff in another history lesson. But in 1920, they said, okay, women can vote. Some states on their own did it beforehand. Wyoming was the very first state to give women voting rights. But the whole United States didn't hop on board until 1920. And it wasn't until 1928 that Great Britain did, that England did. I think. Yes. There we go. Sometimes in lessons you can hear me quietly spelling to myself. These things happen. So it took a really long time from when women started working really hard and spending all of their free time sometimes trying to convince everyone that they had the right to vote before the generally white men in charge decided that they could have the right to vote. Now, this is like this much of the story. There is a whole lot more of the story still to talk about. But for now, keep in mind that 1920 was 100 years ago. That means that women have been allowed to vote in our country for 100 years. And you might hear, in between all of the different virus things that are on the news, people talking about it's the 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote. And when you hear that, I want you to remember in your head, it is not the 100th anniversary of all women getting the right to vote. It is the 100th anniversary, the 100th anniversary of white women getting the right to vote. So anytime you hear someone making some big deal about this celebration, I want you to think, part one, yeah, that is good. I'm glad that finally the United States 100 years ago gave the women the right to vote. But I want you to also think, not all women. It wasn't fair yet. It took a lot of time and a lot of work by a lot of people before it became fair. So that's the end of this history lesson for now. When you follow up, maybe you want to make a timeline and put some of these events on it. You could get online and look up Susan B. Anthony or Elizabeth Cady Stanton and do a little bit of research about them. Maybe you aren't thinking a lot about this right now, but the Industrial Revolution thing reminded you about that factory work. And maybe you want to learn a little bit more about how really weirdly young children were working in scary, dangerous factories, like that book we read. Maybe you want to learn about that. Maybe you want to learn about some men who were decent and helped with working on women's rights, like Frederick Douglass or a whole lot of other guys. Go look it up. Maybe you want to try and figure out why New Zealand did this so soon. Maybe you want to learn about some of the places where women still don't have these rights and find out if there are groups that are working on trying to get them and what work they're doing. Maybe you want to look at groups of people where women have had good rights for hundreds of years already and see what their society is like. Does it feel really different when you research a place where women have had equal or maybe even more rights than men for hundreds, maybe even thousands of years? There are places like that. You have tons of options of how you want to follow up with this. Remember that if you heard the lesson, but it didn't spark anything in your brain, you aren't thinking, I got to go learn more about this, that you can just follow up by finding someone to talk to about this or by writing a bit of notes about the lesson. Not everything has to spark your brain to go find out more, but if it did, that's awesome, and I'm glad. Stay tuned for the lesson on women's rights, the real deal, that will be coming up later, and hope you enjoyed it. Bye, guys.